Good morning, everybody. Thank you for the warm welcome. And I'd just like to say, I think this is really great that your professor has reached out to some community leaders to bring some real life experiences, especially to a class like this, because the skills you're learning here are, of course, things that you'll use in business, but also everyday life. And I think hopefully through some of my examples that I'm able to share, you'll see the power of understanding some of the best tips and techniques for navigating through conflicts, negotiations, or whatever the case might be. So I would really appreciate if you stop me and ask me questions along the way. If you've got specific things, just raise your hand. We'll stop. You will likely be bored to death if I just drone for an hour, and so that's probably not where anybody wants to end up. It's warm in here, so try to stay awake. And if you see me turn red, that is just my complexion and heat, so just happens. So anyways, just a little bit further details about my background. I've had a really long career in healthcare, and been about 30 years in healthcare, starting in Boston, Massachusetts. As I was actually going to Northeastern, I attended a MBA program part-time. And that program, too, was a really great one in that they brought in a lot of adjunct faculty to teach classes. And one of my favorite ones, it was a strategy class. A guy from John Hancock Insurance taught it. And you're on these really deep strategy subjects, and he could bring it down to what he did last year, last week, whatever. And that really, I think, helps you stick with some of the major points that you need to take with you as you leave this organization and go into the workforce. So as Sarah mentioned, I started in Michigan. Thankfully, we're not there today. It's a little chilly, and lived there for 22 years. Still love Spartan basketball, so football not so much. But anyways, moved from there after I graduated, decided to go to one of the coasts. And so when I was choosing what I was going to do after graduation, it was really about where I lived more so than exactly what I did. And so I was either looking at Washington or Massachusetts, somewhere on the East Coast, and ended up finding a job in Massachusetts. So I started there really coming out of a marketing program in sort of sales and trying to learn and understand and use some of the skills that I had from my degree. That was really the entree to getting into the workforce. Over time, I started looking around at even different industries, and healthcare just popped up as one with a tremendous amount of opportunity. And I have to say, having been there for roughly 30 years, there's really never been a day where I haven't felt challenged. There's never really been a day where there hasn't been another opportunity. I'd encourage anybody who's thinking about various industries to take a look at healthcare, because it's just growing by leaps and bounds with, I really think, the need for business-minded people to get involved. It's a really unique partnership with clinical folks and business-minded folks when you come together. And in fact, at Riverside, we do a lot with what we call dyads. We use dyad management. So it would be a doctor and someone like me working to run a hospital, or a physician and a nurse and also a business person, maybe overseeing a series of nursing homes. And really that's the strength in kind of combining what you guys are learning with some of the clinical folks that work in healthcare. So there's lots of opportunity. I also then kind of eased my way into healthcare by parlaying marketing a little bit into healthcare, and I went into fundraising for a medical center in Boston. So fundraising, marketing, you're reaching out to people, you're asking them for money, versus marketing in terms of selling a product or service. So I started working at Boston University's medical center. And during that time, I also started meeting some people that worked in healthcare, and used it as an opportunity to really branch out, talk to them about what they were doing, what their role was, what their career path was. And that's also a tip I'd encourage you to all do as you get out there into the workforce. Take advantage of the people that you work with. Because most often they'll love to talk about themselves. Everybody loves to talk about themselves, right? So I parlayed that into kind of getting into a job in our IT area at Boston University Medical Center. And I don't know why that worked out, but really what I was in a role was sort of a quasi-business role where I was helping the clinical areas do your traditional, if you've ever taken a process improvement class where you map everything out, your workflows, your decision trees, you know, is it a decision point, yes or no? If you go this way, it's this thing, it's that way. Well, my role was really to map out how I started in working with the admitting and registration area, how they worked through sitting in front of a patient and getting a patient admitted. And then taking that over to the IT team who was implementing a system and talking about what screens needed to come up, what information needed to be collected, what needed to be searchable, what had to have free text versus only certain selections that you could put in, and that was really important. So really started learning how, through that job, things work and processes and so forth. So that was an exciting time. At the same time, as I mentioned, I was getting my degree, kind of got an opportunity to get involved in management, so was able to do that and finish my MBA program. With that, gosh, I hadn't taken vacation in like 3.5 years because I really went straight through year-round. So my husband and I, at the time, decided, okay, we're going to take like a month off. And we wanted to move somewhere south and came here to visit some in-laws and ended up in the Williamsburg area. I found a job with Riverside. He ended up working in Richmond for a number of years. So that's kind of how I got here. I think my message to you as young people, be flexible. You know, obviously parlay what you know through your degree and your studies into maybe that first role, realizing that that's probably not your forever job, right? And it's okay. You can certainly zig and zag as you need to. One of the things I even tell my boss when we do performance reviews and discuss, you know, what I've done over the last years, I don't know exactly where I want to go next, but keep me busy and give me lots of opportunities and I'll be happy. And so that's always worked well for me. So you don't necessarily have to have an end point that you can articulate as long as you know you're getting the satisfaction you need to out of your job. So that's kind of a little background about me. And let's move into talking about conflict. And then if there's time, I wanted to share a little bit in negotiations because I know that's the second half of your class. So, but they're very, very related, as you obviously probably know by now. So when I thought about talking about conflict, I kind of thought of some examples, shared those with your professor and Sarah a couple of weeks ago. And then kind of came back and said, you know, if I wanted to think about it, there's really a couple categories that I'd put conflict into. There's your overt conflict where you're maybe observing somebody who's having an argument, or you're a manager and someone brings you a situation that you've got to deal with. And then there's covert, where it's something going on behind the scenes. You may or may not, as a manager, be aware of it. Chances are everybody in your department knows all about it. The manager's usually the last to know. And you know, those are some really difficult situations to deal with, but we can talk about, I'm going to give you some examples, and then we can talk about some of the tips and techniques for dealing with some of those. So let's start with the easy one, overt. You probably all have an uncle like I have an Uncle Tom, is his name. Every single time this gentleman shows up, and I love him, so you know, he's family, it's just how he is. He'll come to the door and he'll say something along the lines of, "Hey, have you put on weight lately?" Or, "How come you're so red?" You know, just to get a rise out of you. And you know, that he's trying to get me to engage in a conflict and get upset, and you know, obviously is right in your face. So that's obviously a covert example. Anybody ever have that happen to you? Have an uncle like that, or some other family member or lovely friend? Well, that's the easy one. Some other ones that I've had to deal with as a manager had to do, this was a little bit difficult because when I was in my role in HR, and I ran HR for Riverside Health System for about 10 years, we have about 60 HR employees scattered throughout our service area, and Riverside service area goes from the Tappahannock area in the northern part of the coast, all the way to the eastern shore, and then almost to Richmond through West Point. So it's quite a large geography. And what the situation was we had two employees that they worked in different units. One was in a corporate support area, and one was in an operational unit. And they happened to know each other outside of work. And so what occurred was they knew each other. I think it was through their church, and so they became friends. And at some point, one of them decided that the other one needed to start coming to more church groups and participating in more activities, and started using social media to very visibly say to this other person, I think you're slacking, you need to be more involved, you need to step up and do the right thing. And they're posting this like on Facebook, and they're posting, then they're also doing texts back and forth. Well, the other individual said, thanks, but no, I've got other things going on. But it somehow kind of spiraled into a real difficult situation. And what brought it to our attention at Riverside was these individuals unfortunately became so entangled in it and very emotional, obviously, and very visibly with social media that they were not getting their job done. All they were doing all day long was texting back and forth or jumping on Facebook and trying to defend themselves. And that's a difficult situation for an employer because, we're responsible for what happens in the workplace, not outside the workplace necessarily, but when problems from outside come to the workplace and then even with the social media aspect, that was a whole other thing, they become workplace issues. So what we ended up having to do in that case was have an HR person go sit with each employee, really learn a little bit about what they were grappling with so that we made sure we had the story straight, and then try to offer some resources. So we have an employee assistance program, we're able to do that. And I think the other big piece of it is we made them aware that their personal issue was impacting their job. And they had these blinders on for a period of time where their point of view was it's just a personal disagreement after hours at work. And we made it, at least had to make it pretty abundantly clear to them that since it was impacting their work, they were threatening their livelihood. If they continued to really just engage in this behavior all day long and not get their jobs done. It's kind of an interesting juxtaposition of kind of bringing work and personal life together. And I struggled with some of these types of cases early on as the HR lead for the organization about, well, I can't say to employee A, you can't post that on social. Well, it's freedom of speech. They can put whatever they want on there. Even though I really wanted to say that's probably not a good idea, I really couldn't and didn't want to do that for that reason. So we just had to boil it down to how it was impacting the workplace. And the other big kind of takeaway I'd say from this is, as you're sometimes maybe not in a conflict yourself, like with me and my uncle, I'm in the conflict. But in this case, I'm an outside observer. You've got to help the two parties that you might be trying to mediate with understand what the impact is to them. They see the symptoms, they know they're angry, they know they're frustrated, they know they might not be sleeping, but when you start to boil it down to it's impacting your job, therefore it could impact your livelihood, and you've got to deal with it, that becomes a little bit more meaningful for them. So that was a difficult one I had to deal with. Anybody ever have situations like that you've had to get in the middle of a couple people? Yeah? Anything you want to share with the group?
Oh, sure. So sophomore year is the first year on campus where you can live with friends. So a couple of my friends and I lived together, and the two roommates were just having a really hard time balancing living together with their friendship outside of it, and they would just not talk about the little things that were bothering them. So it was really starting to affect their friendship. So we I to have a dinner, and we had to sit down and talk about ways to communicate with each other better, because the little things are just little if you talk about them, but they become really big.
Right. It's a good example. Yeah.
My position for my sorority last year was actually to be a mediator between people that were having problems or just things of that nature. So trying to be a non-biased third party, especially when it was something that I had signed up for, was a little hard to do.
Right. Because they're your sisters on both sides, right?
Yep. Extremely well, and obviously I'm going to have an opinion, but trying to was challenging.
How'd you do it? Any tips or techniques?
Trying to just sit people down and get them to speak
Yep.
calmly was something I struggled with, but meeting one-on-one and then kind of bringing it together seemed to help me.
Right. And I think another kind of related thing is to focus on the outcomes of the behavior to not just the symptoms, right? So you can overtly see there's anger between two people in most cases, but if the outcome is, that there's poor productivity in the work unit, focus on that and the impact to the organization, and then bring it back to the individual. Because many times they don't think about that. They're thinking, again, very much about their point of view and not necessarily the impact that whatever it is that they're doing might have on outsiders. Any other examples? Those were good ones. Yep. You'll have more, trust me. Just wait. Okay, so then covert kind of conflicts. Those are the really interesting ones. And so I'll get into a little story here that might take a couple minutes to set up. But so one of my roles when I first came to Virginia and worked for Riverside was to run a new unit that had been created, and it was a joint venture between two organizations. So Riverside owned like 49% of it, and Blue Cross of Virginia owned 51% of it. And what we were doing was, it was early 90s, and we were introducing new insurance products, mainly HMOs, to the Virginia area. And because I was in Boston, they thought, oh, she knows managed care because that's been in Boston for 10 years. So please come down and help us figure this out. So it was really a neat opportunity. And I was working in IT, so I really kind of stayed in the same function. I was working in information systems and helping to set up the system. But the structure of that, when I arrived, so I was a director of information systems, and then over a period of time, I moved into being our finance person. So I was chief financial officer because of my MBA. It gave me a lot of that financial background and acumen. And then I eventually moved to be the vice president of the unit over a period of time. And I was there for about 13 years. The organization started early years, we were losing money. Wasn't a lot of fun. Every time I had to go to the boards, the board is made up of the CEO of the organizations, both parent organizations, the CFO of both parent organizations, and I was like a 30-something, female, and it was pretty intimidating to go to these board meetings and talk about, well, we lost money again, and here's what we're doing. But over time, the unit became really very, very successful. Despite the fact that one of the underlying things that I learned later in the process was that the unit was made up of people that were on Blue Cross's payroll and Riverside's payroll. So you had half and half. So for example, all the salespeople were on Blue Cross payroll, all the provider folks that go around and do contracts with doctors and hospitals, they were all paid by Blue Cross and Blue Shield. All the nurses and a lot of the finance staff and myself, we were on Riverside's payroll. Sounds benign to start with, right? You think, okay, so what? Well, what ended up being the case was people, kind of the chatter, the undertone. I started to catch wind of the fact that people really kind of were worried about the fact that, well, the health insurance from company A versus the health insurance for company B, I pay this much less out of pocket. I have a deductible here, you have one there. And really fairness became to be an issue because these people said, hey, we all work in the same unit. We all share the same goals. We're all trying to make the company better. We're doing our jobs just like you told us to do, but our benefits seem different. And keep in mind that's all point of view too, right? It's in the eye of the beholder. If I'm somebody I'm married, let's say, and I don't need health insurance, then I'm probably going to focus more on how much vacation company A versus company B gets and really pick that apart. Vice versa, some other benefits could be important. But there was this just undercurrent that ran and ran and ran. And then it got really super magnified when the Blue Cross organization went public. Many of you probably don't remember this because you were just running around and minding your own business in your backyards. But In the late 90s, early 2000, Blue Cross of Virginia went from being what was called like a mutual company, kind of like USAA is, so they're owned by their policyholders. Well, they became owned by shareholders, so they basically went public. And that all sounded great because that would give them access to capital markets, that would give them an opportunity to grow on a national platform, and we'd be part of that. But again, at that employee level, now all of these employees, on top of the perceived differences, got stock options on the Blue Cross side only. And everybody knows, and you read all the articles about how fabulous stock options are, right? They're great sometimes, and they're not so great other times in truth. But again, perception. It's not fair that part of the folks get it and part of the other team doesn't get it. So that was a real issue that kind of was running undercurrent and working against, I think, what I considered our next leap forward that we needed to make. So, in a case like that where you've got what I'll call, again, covert conflict going on, one of the tips that I found works, obviously you want to have as many channels of communication open as possible. So we had ability for people to comment and ask questions anonymously, or they could put their names on them if they wanted to. We had, open team meetings where we brought both groups of folks together. And we really tried to facilitate sharing so that, again, just like in the previous example, we had a full understanding of the issues. Because you don't want to go out, set about to solve a problem and you find out that you're solving the wrong problem. So we really, took the time to make sure that we had that appropriate feedback. But also, just in general, by having anonymous feedback channels, I think you can find a lot of things that might be in question among your employees that might be in a given business unit. And then really what we did was, understanding that the core issue was fairness, wanted to sit down with everybody together and talk about it openly and talk about it so that everybody heard the same information at the same time. So we at least started with the premise that we're going to face facts head on. There are differences. This is where we are. Let's get the details out on the table. We actually did comparison. This is what the monthly premium is for company A. This is the monthly premium for health for company B. However, the deductible's down here and up here, so there's differences due to that. And just kind of walked people through that at an end of the day basis on that particular benefit, they're roughly equivalent. Vacation, similar, so we went down the list. We couldn't solve the stock option issue, and that really became kind of where the end of the road was for what I could do and what I could explain away. So then I went to my boss, who was the chief operating officer at Riverside at the time, and said, I understand we don't have stock to give options, so that's kind of out of the question, but how about an enhanced incentive opportunity for these employees? This is a startup unit. We had always called it the lab at Riverside, so we wanted to try out new things. So maybe we have an incentive program that goes right down to the person that answers the phone or is the first person that you greet and at the door. And people had done incentives for leaders at Riverside for a number of years, but really never all employees. So we were able really to put that in place for the team and to get past that issue. So it was a big one that we grappled with, and I think the approach there is to deal with it in pieces, kind of point by point by point, involve everybody, make sure everybody's hearing the same information at the same time, and hopefully get to a solution that most people can live with. And at the end of the day, if they're still not satisfied, you've done everything that you can do. So, what questions would you have about that situation and things that come to mind when I was talking through it? Any questions? Yeah.
How do you determine at what level of there's always talk around the office and there's always a rumble. At what point of tension do you feel the need to step in and say, okay, this is a serious problem we need to solve?
Yeah. That's always a tricky point, but again, symptoms versus outcomes helps me to figure that out, right? If I just see, you know, that people are occasionally upset and it goes away, I don't need to worry about it. But if I can identify that it's impacting operations, other employees, turnover, you look at your turnover statistics, you look at your hiring statistics. We also do employee satisfaction surveys. You start to see themes emerging from these things. When they start to show up on that, that would be a time to deal with it. If it's just, and two, you know, even if it is what we kind of categorize as covert and you don't know about it till kind of after the fact, you can just talk to that one person to figure out what it is and then decide how you're going to address it. But again, keep fairness in mind and make sure everybody knows about it. It's a good question, though. Any others? Okay, you guys are hot or something. I know I am. All right, let's see. One other one I wanted to talk through with you, and I think this was one of the ones that Dr. Fick talked about, that she'd be interested in me talking about, was independent contractors, because you'd done some discussions or about to do some discussions with the group on that, perhaps. I don't recall, when we were having coffee. Yes, you just shake your head yes. So one of the other similar but different issues that we often have in healthcare especially, and probably in other industries, but again, I have worked most of my career in healthcare, was, and especially today, where staffing and finding the right people for critical roles is difficult. You guys are kind of in this demographic bubble, if you will. You know, there's a lot of folks that are in the baby boomers that are way older than you and me. By the way, I'm not a baby boomer. I'm an Xer. But they're retiring, they're moving out of the workforce, and then behind them, the Xers and all the other generations, however they might be named, that follow are much smaller in number. And so it's becoming more and more difficult to find qualified people at all levels of the organization. So what we've seen very frequently, especially with clinical folks, nurses especially, this happens. We can hire a lot of folks, but we have to augment if we have patients that we've got to take care of with contractors. And so you get a situation where you've got a nursing unit, let's say, and you've got people side by side. Some are on Riverside payroll and some are independent contractors. And it's very similar to the situation we just talked about, 2 different payrolls. And fairness becomes an issue, a big issue. The other thing going in this scenario with independent contractors is most of the independent contracting companies that provide staffing, they'll charge companies like Riverside a rate that's roughly double what the employee makes. That's their overhead, that's their administration, that's, you know, all their money. But the urban legend is that they're paying Sally Sue nurse from staffing company $70 an hour, and I'm only making $35. Well, they're not paying Sally Sue $70, they're paying her company $70, right? And she also probably doesn't have benefits. She also doesn't have the opportunity to know that she's going to be working at any given location for some period of time, because contract labor, by definition, you might be there one week and not needed the next week. So really, you know, Sally Sue, the nurse, might make $37 or $38 an hour, so yeah, more, but she's also traded that for flexibility, is really what she wants. She wants to be able to say, okay, I'm going to work, and a lot of clinical folks do this, they work in Florida in the wintertime, and then they come back up to the mid-Atlantic or somewhere cooler for the summertime. That's their flexibility. And they might take a month off to relocate in between. It's a neat way to do it if you can get away with that. But again, on the units, it's somebody's making more than me and they're not even really a full employee here. So that's an issue that we grapple with really on a day-to-day basis. Really what this takes is a lot of explanation, but the one time a manager says something to an employee like, yeah, I know we pay Sally Sue $70 an hour, well then you have a major mess to clean up in the organization, and you've got, you know, if someone gives incorrect information, what I have found and witnessed myself multiple times is it tends to spin out of control. People start making up additional information to go on top of that and make the situation even worse. So the rumor mill, runs covertly all the time. And so I think some of the main things that you can do as leaders and managers is make sure the folks that work for you or work with you have the facts and continually reinforce them, because if they turn over, their new person needs to know everything that they knew, right? So you've got to continually reinforce that and keep that on the forefront. And again, openness, the ability to have some feedback, anonymous loops or direct feedback loops so people can ask questions. Because ideally what you want to get to is an open culture where people are comfortable asking their questions and getting the answers that they need. And that can reduce an awful lot of conflict in and of itself. Let's see. Those were my main examples. Let's talk about different ways to handle kind of overt and covert. We've talked about a few. But let's say you're getting ready to meet with two employees that you're trying to help mediate a conflict with. We talked about some of the things, real examples that you've done, but what are some of the other things that you might think that you want to do in order to prepare for a meeting like that? Yep.
I don't know if it's different in like a professional setting, but I'm a resident assistant. We get trained on mediation between residents, and one of the things that we always start out with is asking everyone to set ground rules in terms of like what they're expecting to gain from the conversation and what's acceptable and how they want to communicate to each other, so that way you're not just sitting down and saying, okay, we have this issue now, battle it out.
Exactly.
And they just get heated.
Yeah, that's a great one. So set some ground rules. And kind of along those same lines, know what you can promise and not promise as a manager. So I don't think you probably could say that you had the ability to find, a one-bedroom apartment for somebody that decided that they needed to move out of the dorm, right? You've got to figure out a more realistic way to solve whatever the issues are. And you need to know that so that you don't overpromise something and then really end up letting everybody down. What other ideas? Yeah.
Kind of going off that train of thought, I would definitely be sure to review the company policy in regards to whatever was going on with the situation, just to make sure that aside from just like promising something that you can't follow through with, when something goes too far or when you need to pull back the reins.
That's right.
during a discussion.
That's a great example. And kind of going back to the example that I talked about with the employees on social media, we do have a policy that says you cannot use your phone during work hours. You can use it on break, you can use it on your lunch hours, but we don't want you using it when you're supposed to be taking care of patients. And that was an important piece to bring into the conversation, to remind them of what the policy is, that they know about at some level. They went to orientation, but it might have been a while ago. But yeah, that's always good. And then kind of along those lines, sometimes you have legal issues that are kind of around the fringes, and you just want to understand, so know when you need to seek help from an attorney. I happen to have my office right next to our corporate counsel, so I get to pop over and ask questions, whether they're good ones or not. He still answers them. And that's always a nice safety net to know before I go into a difficult situation, that I've got that base covered too. Yeah.
I'm the type of person that doesn't like to be caught off guard by a lot of things.
Right.
So when I go to try to mediate people, I try to know what exactly happened in the previous conflicts. That way I don't go in with a certain mindset and then one of the two people bring up a different scenario that I had no idea about, and it just throw me off and not being able to handle that.
Yeah. And no matter how much you prepare, it'll likely happen anyways at some point, but you've got the right mindset. And I think part of that preparation is to put yourself in each party's shoes. Think about it from their point of view, because it's empowering to think about it, and you've got to really kind of step back and think about it from their personal, professional, whatever else you might know about them could be impacting how they're reacting, and then that can help you out tremendously as well. So that's a very strong thing to be able to do if you have the time, right? And then hopefully get that covered that way. Any other? thoughts? Yeah.
I have a question kind of going back to something you mentioned previously about making sure new people are always in the loop and ahead of the transitions. So I'm on the executive board for my sorority, and we have a new leadership board every year.
Yep.
So I was wondering if you had any experience and tips on making those transitions smooth and making sure that a level of respect is maintained, but also keeping that communication clear.
Yep. That's a good question. So did everybody hear that over there? Okay. You know, one of the things, and I've had changes in board members happen with, so I'm the operator in many cases, and a new board member comes on and you've got to get them to the same level of whoever they're going to be working with. So number one, writing things down, you know, having a orientation manual sometimes is really good when you're bringing on new committee or board members. So you're trying to write down and put in a book that someone can read all of your cultural norms, your rules, your policies, maybe some of the current things that you might have been dealing with, and really set a definitive time to go through that with somebody, because it's very, very important. That has worked well. The other thing is, I would say, to set up meetings with others that are either their peers or people that they'll be working with, and just say, go around and do a meet and greet and talk about your new role from, with that hat on, which is probably a different interaction than you might have had with them previously. Maybe you were just their buddy and you went to movies together, but now as an executive committee member, I need to be responsible for certain things that maybe we've never talked about before. So use that as an opportunity to really kind of seek input for those that you'll be working, or from those that you'll be working with. So those would be two ideas. Anybody else have any other ideas for her that maybe you've done? Okay. One of the other really effective techniques, and this is one I use a lot, but especially in cases where I might not have had really good time to prepare. Sometimes you're dealing with a conflict. You got to deal with it right now. You can't go away and say, well, I'm going to prepare and I'll get back to you. And everyone's like fuming, standing by your door. You've got to deal with it. But you can bring the parties together, and you can do this separately or together, and say, tell me about possible solutions that you might have to what we're dealing with here. Really ask for their input on some of the ways that they might see how we could get from where we are today to the desired result of working harmoniously in a group and getting done what we need to get done without the conflict. And many times that also helps to set their expectations, right? Because they know you can't solve everything with a wave of your magic wand, and that you are just human, so they're not going to look you in the eye and say, well, I'd like a transfer to the office of the CEO. They're going to say, really what I'd like to do is I just want to get back to getting my job done without having to worry about someone texting me 35 times in an hour. And if that's the ask, then you know what you're going to talk to the other party about very definitively. So that does work pretty well, and especially in a pinch. That's one I've gone to sometimes. Okay. Well, any other questions on conflict? I think really we covered, oh yeah.
How do you deal with conflict more between peers, but who are kind of mid-management? I find that when in my job, there's some underlying tension between members of management who don't communicate because they really only come together during meetings or briefly interact with each other. So they'll get very upset, but then we'll let it go because they don't have to speak to that other manager for a while. But then it creates tension going into every other situation.
Yeah. So they're your peer in this example, and then peers with someone else that they might not get along with? Gotcha. Okay. Yeah, those are difficult because it's probably impacting the effectiveness of whatever you're doing and whatever you're working on. So I guess there's a couple things. You can, if it's something that you could speak with them about and make them aware of the outcome of what they're doing on you, that is powerful if you're comfortable doing it. The other option you have is to go to their direct reports, and talk to them. It's really about keeping the communication lines open. Some people tend to think, oh boy, when that employee survey comes out, I'm going to blast this situation. Well, you know what the problem with that is? They tend to be anonymous. So you get, like, we have 10,000 employees. And when I was in the HR role, I'd read all the open comments. There were 750 pages of open comments. And if I got something like that, I'd always try to think, what can I do with this? Because I don't know who this is. So you've got to use the communication channels, the, kind of the command structure. Hopefully, again, if there's an anonymous feedback loop, that's always good. But I think I would just say, as a responsible employee for an organization, if you see something like that happening, you kind of need to try to let folks know the impact and do what you can do. Because otherwise it just bubbles and boils and makes for a very unpleasant work experience for everybody.
Thank you.
Yeah, sure. Okay, we have, I think, a half an hour, so I'll go into negotiation if that's okay, kind of jump ahead, if you're all right with that. Good. So this is actually the really fun part of what I thought we'd talk about. Over the last year, and we do this in a cycle of like every 4 years, my team and I negotiated about 40% of our revenue with our contracts with third-party payers. So Riverside's about a $1.2 billion company, so we're talking, somewhere in the $400,000 to $500,000 range. We were kind of trying to negotiate contracts for, which is a pretty stressful experience. But it's even more stressful when I tell you how this all was going. So I'm going to draw this. This is my crude rendering. I didn't bring slides. I'm sorry. So here we have Riverside. And so we have Managed Care Organization 1. So this is Insurance Company 1. Managed Care Organization 2. And this guy we'd never contracted with before, okay? And they both were going on simultaneously. This company is a company that really is a partner with Riverside, and we probably about 90% of our commercial revenue comes from that party. So if we blew this deal and all of a sudden we didn't have $350 million coming into the organization, it was going to not be good. Not be good at all. So, but with that in mind too, we also knew that we wanted a fair contract. Fairness is a big human, need, is to be treated fairly. Whether you're an organization or a person, you always want to be treated fairly. And so we knew we wanted to be fairly treated. We also knew that there were some things that this other company was starting to implement. There's really two big areas you negotiate in these contracts are basically your rates and then your terms. Your rates are your dollars per unit, and your terms are how they pay. Not necessarily meaning like within 30 days, but do I need in some cases to have an authorization before I do a specific service? Do I need in some cases to try a certain procedure before I can do a higher level procedure? Do I need to, let's put it in real terms, do I need to do an x-ray before I do an MRI, right? That's kind of what I'm talking about, because the x-ray costs $50 and the MRI is $500. So in some cases, managed care organizations dictate terms like that, so you have to know what they are and follow them. And some are very reasonable, that's reasonable. Some less so from our perspective, point of view. So we had to go through and figure out what was happening with this huge contract that impacts our entire organization. What were the things that we needed to try to negotiate in terms of dollars and business terms? So we got that process all going. And one of the things we implemented, which I think is really good in a very complex, large, and very important organization, was we had an internal task force that we used to kind of keep us honest. So what my negotiating team would do is monthly we got together with this task force, and it included the CEO, the COO, the CFO, so the finance operations leaders. It included our lead pharmacy person, because pharmacy pricing was going to be a big thing. Included the guy that ran our revenue cycle, so they do all the billing and all the collections. It included our clinical folks that handled all the authorizations and so forth. And what we did was we brought them all together to talk about where we were, what our last offer was, what their pain points were in seeing how we were, implementing and working with this contract, and to make sure that we weren't giving up on things too easily or pushing things that maybe were not top of the list that we had to resolve. So we're going along and we're doing this like the beginning part of the year. The contract ended the 31st of December 2018. We started this process in January of 2018, so we had the full time. So as with anything, you start with it, kind of the dance of negotiations. So we lead with, we would like increases of, and of course you're going to negotiate these down. So you're up here and they come in down here. And then you go here and here and here and here. And eventually you get to the point where your terms or your rate, you know that they don't have a whole lot more leeway and you don't have a whole lot more leeway. And it becomes a lot about the terms. So that's what was going on back and forth. Meanwhile, we knew healthcare is in a tremendously pressured situation right now. And so our rates from government payers, so for Medicare and Medicaid, have been really flat for, I would say, the last 4 to 5 years, and they're expected to continue to remain flat and even decline because they're tying more of it, you've probably read about this, to quality outcomes, which is the right thing to do. But it means that unless we demonstrate that we're improving in having fewer readmissions, so that means when you're discharged and then 30 days later you don't come back to the hospital, which is what everybody wants. If you have higher than average readmissions, they're going to reduce your rate. If you have lower than average readmissions, they're going to increase your rate. So it's not based on kind of a cost of living adjustment anymore. It's based on how you do. But the disconnect is I still pay cost of living raises to all my employees, right? Every time I go to buy a product year over year over year, there's some sort of increase because it increases, the supplier of that product is paying increases, costs more to transport things, all those factors. So kind of my cost of goods is constantly going up and my reimbursement is staying flat, and then it could even go down if I don't do well on some of these outcome measures. So it's a difficult situation to be in. So we look at contracts like these with the outside commercial companies, they're also changing to that same type of structure. And so that they might guarantee a 1% or 2% rate increase, but if I want to have 5, I've got quality metrics I need to meet, and that's fine. But you have to understand that's a pressure that's going on. And then you have things like Medicare last year, and sometimes Congress does this too, they make changes that go into effect and you have little to no time to react to them. So one of the big ones we had last year was there was a reduction to our reimbursement for medications that Riverside receives from Medicare. And we receive it because we care for a larger than average proportion of patients that can't pay. And it was like $12 million right off the bottom line. No warning, overnight. Not so much overnight, but I mean, we had a little bit of warning that it was being discussed, but boom, it's gone. So you got to figure out now how you're going to make up $12 million. So that makes this even more important. So one of the things that I did was I got involved with our strategic plan. So I changed jobs in January of last year. I moved out of the HR role and kept everything else I had, so the process improvement, business intelligence, managed care contracting, all that other stuff that Sarah read about. And I started a new strategic corporate strategy role. And so we were working on our strategic plan, and what becomes apparent when you're faced with downward pressure on your prices, you can either cut your expenses, but they can only go down so far, or you can grow your top line volume, right? Because your unit cost is staying roughly the same, so you need more. You got to produce more. So how are we going to do that? And the answer was, we got to contract with these guys. And we had never done it before. So why had we never done it before? Well, because these guys are owned by one of our biggest competitors. And so we don't like them, the competitor, right? we're like, peas and carrots, and, we're complete opposites. And so what I had all of a sudden introduced as another dynamic was both our senior leaders and some of our board members, they became influencers in this because they didn't want this to happen. And it's just long-held belief that you don't make a competitor stronger. Why in the world would you do that, right? But we had to make the point, or I, really was struggling to make the point, well, okay, I get that, but either we shrink and reduce our expenses to the point where they're bare bones, or we grow volume, and this is the only quick way to do it. So one of the things that we did was really get our strategic, when we engaged an outside firm, because outside advice is often considered better advice than inside advice. Take it with a grain of salt. It's the way it is, and you just need to know that. But if you work with the right folks and they are astute enough to understand that you've got some insider information, you can work together on these things. What we did was we said, okay, can you help us quantify the pros and cons of contracting with managed care organization 2? And that should be part of the strategic plan. And they said, my gosh, yes, because that's 50,000 people that live in your service area that can't come to Riverside because you don't have a contract. So there's a lot. So they helped us to quantify that, and that was helping me to get through to this group and to this group, that really we had to go ahead and contract with MCO2 or our alternatives. There were alternatives, but they weren't good. Nobody wanted to do them. So we started the conversation with this group. Now, other dynamics happening here was this group became led by an individual that they brought from the Midwest. So he was not a homegrown health system person. New face here, knew how to run insurance companies, and really kind of had a fresh look. We also had a new senior leader, Chief Clinical Operations Officer. My boss had come in from the Northeast, and he was seeing, hey, this is an opportunity. I don't understand why we're not pursuing it. So at least had 2 new people, and when you're doing negotiations, fresh eyes, because again, sometimes the people that have been there a while, we've heard what you've said for years. These fresh eyes have come in and said, yeah, you should probably think about that. So I got the 2 of them together. I got my guy together with their guy, and they said, yeah, this is great, let's move forward. And we had tried this a few years ago, and it ended because we were asking for rates here, which were equivalent to where we were getting our rates, and they wanted a bargain basement deal. But this guy said, I can grow my MCO more than enough to offset for paying market competitive rates. So it's a good thing for me to do, and that's my goal, is I want to grow my company. So finally, some rational business minds came to the table. So that helped out tremendously. So what we were doing simultaneously, negotiating with these 2 groups, and my goal from the CEO was, if you can get these guys to agree to what you're getting here plus 3 to 5%, okay. So that's where we tried to go, and ultimately, thankfully, it worked out. But really kind of the message to you guys is you've got to realize all the other, folks, all the other people, and all the other topics that can come into play on a negotiation. Sometimes are not the most obvious. You're talking to this MCO, but the other ones, you've got to figure out how you're going to navigate through that, because if I didn't have the agreement of senior leadership and the board of directors to contract with them, I could have made the best deal in town, and then they said no, and that was going to be problematic. So that was another thing that we sort of learned through that process. I think the other technique that I want to share with you on this one, the other thing we did was, since it was such a large negotiation for both of the groups, we also took a team and divvied up negotiation responsibility. So I had one person who was very involved in that terms section. I kind of took the lead on the rates section at a high level, but then I had another person who dealt with, okay, if I negotiate a 3% overall increase, there's inpatient, there's ambulatory surgery, there's physician, and then within there's other components, and then they helped to divvy it up and negotiate where it was all going to go based on the increases we might need to offset increasing costs at a higher rate in one section versus another part of the business. And that's a really good technique to do so that you can have those detailed people get involved in the details. But you also need to have limits. So, right, they can't necessarily, they know where their ability to negotiate and their ability to agree begins and ends. And then it also allows them, if they get to that endpoint and can't go any further, to elevate it. And so they can elevate it within both companies. So we've had situations where one of those folks on the teams might have been, working on how an authorization process might work, and they reached an impasse with their counterpart. Each of those folks elevated to their next level up, and then those individuals had a discussion and many times can resolve the issue and then get things back on track. So teams of negotiators work well as long as you have parameters that people know that they can operate freely within. They understand their goals and they understand their limits. The other big piece, as I mentioned, I think was the task force. That was good. One piece I want to mention, fairness, back to that real quick. So again, we wanted to make sure that we felt we were fairly being reimbursed. So we decided to have an outside group come in and benchmark what our payment rates were with as big a sample size as they could. So we used an actuarial firm. I don't know if you all know what actuaries are, but they're basically really smart math people. And they can build mathematical models out of almost anything. And so they had access to millions of data points where they could say, these are facilities that are like your Riverside facilities, and just give us averages. They didn't tell us who those facilities were. We can't know them. That would be insider trading or something like that equivalent in nonprofit world. But we knew for the Northeast we were here, for the Mid-Atlantic we were there, and then we narrowed it down to Virginia competitors. And we found in some cases we were where we needed to be, in some cases we were not. So we knew where we wanted to target our asks as a result of that. And we also shared that with MCO1 to say things like, now of course they said your data's wrong, our data shows this. So you have the data argument, that's a whole sidebar argument, but at least you can agree to disagree sometimes. And a real example of this was we didn't show them our data, we kind of talked about it and held it up. And they went back and they said, okay, well, we'll show you what our data says, because of course we know what we pay everybody in Virginia and we know where you are. So they came back with a piece of information that left out selected hospitals. They didn't tell us, they said, hospital A through G, but then they said, these include blah, 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 blah. So they listed all of them, they just didn't tell us who they were, but they left out some of the major ones. Then I can poke holes in theirs, So we went around and around in that regard for a little while, but ultimately what ended up happening was a few of the larger payment terms got negotiated. The overall increases were close to being done. And then similar to what I said with, kind of having different teams handle different parts and then escalating as needed, I got in the car with our CEO a couple times and we drove to talk to this company and just, we got their CEO together with us and we said, so here's where we are. We don't want to not provide service to your members, so can you help us? And I think that helps to nudge things forward. So you're it's almost 360 negotiating is kind of what I'm coming to think about this as. You're starting, you've got bottom-up negotiating with your teams. You're talking to different levels of the organization. Then you've also got your boards. You've got internal committees. You've got people that just have an opinion that is very important that you've got to take into consideration. So you're never really in a big negotiation like this just talking to one party versus another party. What questions do you have on that one? was just a piece of cake, yeah.
So, speaking about this negotiation and the 360 idea, so you mentioned a lot of the discussion between the MCO2 and Riverside, but did you have to do anything additional with the partner that you had previously to make sure that they didn't feel as though they were being kind of diminished as well?
That's a great question. That was late November, and what we knew was we were so close to agreeing on both agreements. What we wanted to do was we wanted to sign the MCO1 deal and then announce MCO2 and get all that, because that was our biggest revenue source, very important, and obviously long-standing relationship. And so what ended up, I think MCO1 figured at some point this was happening, or heard unofficially, not from us, heard that this was going on, so they start dragging their feet. Like, well, the guy that needs to sign that's out of town for the next 2 weeks. What? And so we literally went up and gave them the contract and said, we really need this signature because we've got to implement some of the changes that we've agreed on. And it was true. We had to implement in our systems some of the agreed upon term changes for January 1st, or we weren't going to make it, and it's the end of November. So between that and just basically calling out for favors, like, these are people that I've worked with for a number of years, and I just said, could you please sign it? And at that point, I think they knew. They did eventually, and then within days, we announced a retroactive agreement with MCO2 that went back to mid-November, and we did move forward with that. So it was very tenuous there for a while, and it all happened, all the signatures within 1 week. I couldn't believe it. Yeah, it was a good week. Yeah, it was. Any other questions? Yeah.
Go ahead, AJ.
Okay. You mentioned something earlier when you brought up contracting in with MCO2. You ran into some resistance with senior leaders and the board of directors just because they had this opinion that you shouldn't contract with them.
Right.
I'm running into a very similar situation, not to that scale by any stretch, but I was hired in to help improve a process at my job and in my department, and I have come up with a way to do it. I talked to my manager, they've approved it, but I'm running into some resistance with people that have done it the old way for 20, 30 years, and I'm having a hard time convincing them why this is a good idea.
Yep.
What advice do you have?
Yeah. Well, one of the things that I did, and you could do even on the scale you're talking about, is, what does it hurt to try, right? That argument. And if it is just a new process, you can obviously change back to the old way, right, if it doesn't work. But come up with some way to measure process A or process B and see which one is more effective. Get agreement that you're going to look at it for 90 days and then reconvene. Like, let's work on this together type of thing. In my case, I said, I have a contract, we can terminate this contract with 90 days notice if you don't like it. Okay, I can deal with that, so that helped to give that, level of confidence that it wasn't a forever thing, and if we really did misstep, that we certainly could get out of it, retract, and go back to the way it was.
Sally, can you talk a little bit about what it was within the strategic planning process that you were able to use to move the CEO and the board members towards MCO number 2? Because they were pretty dug in historically that they didn't want to do that. But you discussed earlier that you use strategic planning and mission. Can you recall, what aspects of that process were you able to use to move them forward?
Sure. It ended up falling under one of our, so when you're doing a strategic plan, you're essentially looking for opportunities to improve. And what a good process generally does is it'll kind of categorize those. So some might be cost reductions and efficiency. Some might be new market entrants. Some might be affiliating with certain partners. This one fell under growth, right? So we asked the strategic planning group to have a category of help us identify things that we can do to grow. And I knew that I wanted this to be one of those. So I kind of softballed it to them and said, and I gave them the numbers. I said, so we're trying to get a contract done, potentially. I'd reached out to MCO2 and found out how many health plan members they had in our service area, and there was about 50,000. And from that, you can calculate for 50,000 people, there's use rates, right? So on average, 1 in 100 goes to the hospital over a year. Hopefully 50 in 100 go to their primary care doctor, et cetera, and sort of extrapolate that out to what the total usage of that population would be, and then say, okay, if we're just ramping up and maybe we have 10 or 20% of that utilization come to Riverside next year, that's worth X dollars. And so we quantified it very financially, and I think I told you, I finally went to my CEO and I said, well, I can give you 55 million reasons why we need to sign this contract. And he said, okay. So, that works powerfully to have the numbers to back it up. Especially, we'd also done the environmental analysis as part of that strategic planning exercise, seeing all these outside forces that we can't control, and saw this as one thing that we could very directly control and needed to take action on it for that reason.
So you all have learned this as evidence-based argument, right?
Good.
That's what we talked about. And what other questions the students had for me on Tuesday that I wanted to get your opinion on? What if, so they're learning how to engage in conflict in a healthy manner, how to negotiate. What if they have a manager over them that is an avoider, who doesn't know how to engage in conflict in an appropriate or productive way? We talked about upward leading and modeling in class on Tuesday. What advice would you give to people coming into a new career or a new job, or even if they've been around for a while, they have a boss who isn't a productive part of that process? How would you recommend that they deal with that to make that work out?
Well, some of it depends on company culture. And hopefully in that scenario, you're with a company that has a good culture, an open culture, transparent culture. A couple things that I would say right off the bat, see your HR person. They can help you navigate a situation like that often better, especially as a new employee. They can help you to navigate. They might, and likely if they're a good HR person, probably already know that manager's weaknesses and have figured out how they can assist other employees in that same situation. And they also then have the incumbent responsibility, at least my group did, to do something about it. So let's talk to the manager's manager about how we can get this person into a program where they might learn better skills of coping with things. At Riverside, I know we very seriously take input like that and also employee survey feedback and say, you need to be in like the top 10th percentile or 90th percentile. So you're basically in the top 10 in your employee satisfaction. Otherwise, we put you through a series of improvement classes. So we learn, they do things like you guys did. I think you did a skills inventory. So they learn their strengths and their weaknesses. Then they target their learning to address and improve some of their weaknesses. And in many cases, in most of our cases, we have seen either people realize their weaknesses and choose not to embark in things that might correct them and instead leave the company, which is fine. It's not a bad outcome if they're not the right place. Or make tremendous improvements, and there you can see it in satisfaction scores. So I think using your HR team is always good. If you don't have that option, you got to kind of assess the culture. But I probably would not talk to that person's boss directly until I've had a conversation with that person if I'm comfortable. If for some reason I'm uncomfortable, then I would elevate beyond that. So it kind of depends on what the situation is. I don't know if that helps, but probably a very corporate answer. All right, I think a couple more minutes. Anything else that we can talk about?
More questions, guys? This is your opportunity. Oh, here we go.
Oh, yeah.
How did you prepare yourself and get comfortable during your first contract negotiation? Was it intimidating to kind of walk into that setting?
Yeah, it was. And I was on the other side. So my first contract negotiation I did as a payer, because it was when I was with the managed care organization, that joint venture I talked about early on. And again, I was a young female, and in some of these situations I had to go sit down with doctors, plastic surgeons, neurosurgeons, you know, and it was very intimidating, right? But in the case of, one thing I was always comfortable with, and so you kind of understand your strengths and what you're comfortable with. But one thing I was always comfortable with was numbers. So I would bring in, you know, information to them to explain to them how maybe what we were asking for, what it meant to them. Was it going to be good? Was it going to be bad? And generally, I mean, you're not going to put forward a contract that's not going to probably be a win-win. You know, you're not going to necessarily go to somebody unless you have really evidence to the contrary to say, I need to cut your reimbursement because you're 60% paid higher, and you know, then if you don't, what we might have to do is just terminate our relationship and I'm going to send everybody to your competitor. I never had to do that, but generally what I did to get people to agree was really just put the numbers down, have a couple conversations. Many times we had to go talk to their group practice partners, and those are always like late night meetings or early morning meetings. But again, bringing the facts, I think, was the biggest thing. Yep.
So, kind of a little bit off topic, but earlier you said that like a business person is needed in healthcare fields, like kind of like run hospitals and things like that. But how would you suggest getting your foot into the medical field if that's something like any of us are interested in?
Yeah. Well, I think, you know, you look at different parts of the organization where you can add value. So, you know, like I said, I took the marketing concept and said, okay, hospital development, fundraising. Another great entree for young people in organizations, and I always look at the folks that we have in this area as our up-and-coming leaders, is process improvement. They're working on a daily basis all throughout the organization on projects from everything from increasing the capacity in our operating rooms by figuring out how to get start times to happen close to start, making sure that, you know, RNs are not wheeling gurneys down the hallway, and the process is that that's, you know, a lower level person. They get into the weeds on this stuff, but they come out understanding all the details. So you want a job that gives you good exposure. Finance is another good entree into a health system, but what you want to do is make sure you speak early on with your boss and let them know that you are interested in other things, because if you go into one of those functional areas, you're going to want to get involved in projects as soon as you can. And healthcare has been, like I said, the land of opportunity for me, because I've always wanted to get involved in other projects. I've done everything from setting up call centers to selling buildings, building buildings. I have no background in that, but it was fun because I just understood how projects worked. So, you know, you just want to make sure that folks know that you are interested in doing that stuff. Yeah.
So I work for smaller businesses. My stepdad owns a local business, and we, I know a common problem with smaller businesses is that they can't like afford the people or the time or the money for negotiation teams.
Yes.
So do you have any further advice that can help?
Yeah. Well, outside contractors sometimes can help, but if you have an affordability problem, that's difficult. You know, I actually went to a class on negotiations that was offered at William and Mary. So there are, you know, you get your skills up to speed. They did a lot of simulations. So it was like during their spring break, they offered it to business people, and they did negotiation simulations and that sort of thing. So look for opportunities like that. Small business associations. I know in Williamsburg there's a group of folks called SCORE. They're retired executives from companies around the country. They'll help small businesses write strategic plans and probably advise. So there's groups like that that you can reach out to. Yep.
If I can write on that, along with SCORE, the retired executive, a board of advisors. Most small businesses don't use board of advisors effectively, but just people who don't have a dog in the fight can help you and help you do things that you haven't done before.
Yep.
In your Small Business Development Center, Small Business Administration, they'll provide resources to support you if you're a small business that just absolutely cannot afford a consultant, don't have the contacts in the community, and not sure what to do. That class at William and Mary, taking a class to get your skills up so that you at least know what's happening to you when you get completely run over in the process. But having advisors to help you you won't get, you won't get run over in the process, you know? Yeah, sorry, I had to
Thank you.
piggyback on that, because I was going, yes, that's good, that's good.
So I think we're right on time here. Thank you all. It's been fun. I appreciate your attention.